All right, just wanted to give you a little rundown as to how I like to do my minis. Overhead lamp here. Back here are probably the two most important things. This is thinner, this is oil. So once I'm done, for example, painting, blah, I want to clean my brush in two ways. Water with soap, get all the big debris out. I got a towel here on my lap. Push down, twist, and pull at the same time because you want these bristles to stay as straight as possible. The more and more you use them, the more you're going to get that little bend that you see there. Dry it off as well as you can into the thinner over here. Whoops, depth perception. Brush the rest out. Your thinner is going to change color a little bit. That's fine. You can also use this to loosen up your paint so it spreads a little better. Same deal here. Push, twist, pull. Over here, now we've got our oil. I use an extra bottle of Hops gun oil. Keeps the bristles soft. Ah, son of a bitch, go back on. There we go. Just a little bit of oil. Let that soak in for just a couple of seconds. Now we don't want that mixing with our acrylic, so same process. Push, twist, pull. And that should keep your brush nice and soft so the bristles don't splay. You don't want any paint in there, otherwise they'll get brittle and your brushes will snap. And then you get dry brushing brushes, which I usually trim. And they wind up looking like this. I do the same process for them because you do want them to stay relatively straight. All right, now I know the camera always makes the quality look a little bit worse, but we are finished with what we would call the base coat here. All of our primary colors are in. What they are missing now is shadows and highlights, and we're going to show you just how to do that in a sec, but you'll know roughly when you're finished when you don't have any more, and you may have seen it in the time lapse, but you don't have any more overlap where any of these colors were, like down here on this foot. Some of the back of that guard there, that leather color, splashed down on the foot, and I had to use a tiny brush to patch that up. So what we are looking at here is something that, from a distance, minus the base that needs to get painted, might be good enough to throw on a table, but we want to do better. We also need to add some eyes underneath those eyebrows that are looking very thick and bushy right now. Couple of dots of white, tiny dot of maybe blue. We'll be on our way. So, first thing we're going to do now that we have our base coat done, is we're going to find some shaders that match up with the colors that we want. I am going to start by using Nuln Oil. Shake it up, see all that settlement on the bottom. Give it a good whack. Yeah, some of it moved around. Yeah. We'll use that on all this sort of blackish gray area. That'll fill in the low points. Give it a little bit more of a black look. We'll do some brown here on the back. I have this Agrax Earthshade. And we will try to very carefully fill in some of these low points, as opposed to what we're going to do with the Nuln Oil and just throw it all over all the black indiscriminately. And that should give us some deeper, more muted colors, which is what we want with this sort of fantasy look. And we're going back to the time lapse to see how this turns out. Check in a bit. All right, so we have done about 2 different types of washes so far, or shades as you might want to call them, actually as they're labeled. And right off the bat, we've got a little bit more depth to some of these areas, a few more vibrant colors. The browns are really putting in a lot of work right now, which is great. Here on these sort of shin guards, we only took a very tiny brush and filled in just underneath those little recesses right there. Everything else that's supposed to be brownish got a nice slathering in it. Now, especially while it's still drying, it does sort of have that almost, fresh leathery or kind of plasticky look that we want to get rid of, especially here on the rest of his gi. We want that to be sort of matte colored, which we can accomplish with a little bit of dry brushing. We'll do after we add some more shade to the face area. I've got right over here, Raikund Flesh Shade. I'm going to use that. It's got these nice warm tones, not so dark. We'll do that on the areas around the mask and the area of his neck that's exposed. And then we're going to use, where's my red one? Here it is. Karaberg Crimson for the red areas of his katana. And should be Drakenhof Nightshade. Drakenhof? I don't know, you tell me. We'll check back in a few. Okay, the shading process is done. One thing I did neglect to mention while I was working on sort of the metal areas on his katana, I did use Cryptek Armor Shade Gloss. I find it doesn't, mute the sort of metallic luster that some of these paints have, especially, what was it that I used here? The brass. Is it brass? Yeah. Rune Lord brass that I use for the shin guards. Oftentimes a lot of the shaders have a way of muting or dulling some of the luster that you get on these metal paints. So the gloss Armor Shade does a decent job at keeping it, well, shiny, glossy, for lack of a better term. So let's talk about dry brushing. Now with some of your really tiny, finer brushes here, hard to tell what size this is, you want to keep them nice and pointed. That's why when we're done using them, we put them in our conditioner, or in this case, my oil. Pull, twist, get that nice and straight. We don't want any excess. It's straight as we can get, actually. Personally, I don't mind the little tip that we get here. I find that helps me lever into places that I might not get otherwise. But for dry brushing, you want a brush that is wide and frayed, like what I've got here. Hard to get it in focus, but what we have is a very, very splayed, abused, beat up brush. Now we still want to keep this nice and soft and conditioned, but we need to cover a wider area with it. First and foremost, we want to try to get a lighter color. Dry brushing is typically used to try to get either lighting effects or highlights. So in this case, we want to get a lighter color of what his gi and sort of tunic are right now. In this case, we used Corvus Black here, and we are going to mix some of that Corvus Black with our white scar here, and we're going to use this brush to try to get some of the highlights. I also have another brush, significantly smaller for those smaller areas, that we'll use to dry brush. And that should get us some highlights on the black areas. And you're going to do a similar process for the rest of your colors. Either mixing, white in them if you want to do quick and dirty. There's other ones that you could add for some more color if you wanted them to be muted or more earthy tones. Flayed One Flesh works really well for that. Sometimes you can mix in browns or reds. Comes down to preference. So let's get to dry brushing. We'll start with the tunic and the gi rather, and we'll pop in and see where we go. All right, it's dawned on me as I was filming this that I haven't really explained how to do dry brushing appropriately. Oh, shoot. So what I prefer to do, and you may have seen it in the time lapse, I wind up brushing my hand. You take a little bit of your paint. So in this case, I'll take a very tiny amount of our Corvus Black and we'll lay it down on our palette. And we'll take an even tinier amount of our white scar, or really you could use generic white paint. You don't have to use the really high quality stuff while dry brushing. Cheaper stuff may tend to flake a little bit more and then peel off when you're done, which could leave you a little frustrated. Where'd I put it? There we go. And we mix it together, kind of with all of our brush. We want to get that paint as much into the bristles as we can. And then we want to dry it off and leave as little there as possible, but on the entirety of the brush. So I've got a slightly lighter shade of gray than I had before, and I wind up getting just enough to leave the slightest trail on the more raised bumps of my skin, and that's how I can tell that I'm ready to dry brush. Now you just want to lightly go over the higher areas of your figure. And this is sort of a cheap and easy way to do highlights without having to sit there and meticulously do thin layers on top of thin layers. It's just, in my experience, an easy way to get some higher quality looking miniatures out on the table. I've done it the other way, especially with musculature. There was a figure I did not too long ago who was wearing a very open vest, and I spent a lot of time trying to get the highlights on the muscles right, and so I would wet brush them all. And so now, if you can tell, we've got some much cleaner highlights. It doesn't look quite as plasticky as before, and the fabric tends to pop. We might want to do a little more here on those higher areas. But needs a little more. Now eventually, you know, you're gonna have to go back and either remix some more paint on your palette or pick up some more for your brush and then dry it off again until you've got just the right amount. Now if you're using acrylics, should be safe. All the Citadel paints are acrylics, and this washes off with a little bit of warm water and soap. Now let's finish the dry brushing on the rest of the figure, and then we'll get the base painted. Do some touch-ups if we need it. All right, at this point in time, most of our dry brushing is complete. Actually, just about all of it is complete. Our goal here is to get the base painted, and if we can finagle past the katana in front of his face, and try to get some eyeballs in that face. All right, cue the time lapse. And there we have them. Not too long, bit of a speed paint, but I'm satisfied with the result here. I mean, if I were to take this onto my table, my players and I would be happy to see it. There it is. Finger for scale. Overall, not bad. So yeah, that's the basic rundown of the process, at least. If you have questions, let me know.